Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second webinar in our legal informational series, The Legal Process for Intended Parents. My name is Joy Rejholec. I'm the Chief Administrative Officer with Family Source Consultants, and I am joined today by Ryan Ferrante, our Assisted Reproduction Attorney and Intended Father. So welcome, Ryan.
Hey, Joy. Great to be back with you.
Awesome, always. Now, I say second webinar because Ryan and I just previously recorded the legal process for gestational care surrogates. So if you are wanting to know more about that after our discussion today, you can always go to FamilySourceConsultants.com, enter our media and events page, and you'll have full access to all of our webinars, including the one that we just recently completed. So Ryan, always a pleasure to have you. I'm going to let you kick it off by kind of telling us a little bit more about yourself and what you do.
Yeah, so I am a collaborative reproduction attorney, an assisted reproduction attorney, an assisted reproductive technology attorney. There's many different names for it, but um, uh, there's one primary focus, which is any sort of third-party reproduction, surrogacy, egg donation, any sort of gamete donation, embryo donation. That's where I'm involved. And I didn't. A lot of this is similar content to the conversation that we had in the past, but it's also important. I start every conversation with any potential client by sharing that I didn't come to this practice of law by accident. I am a former intended parent myself. I have two children that were carried by a wonderful gestational carrier. And so I pivoted my career from corporate tax into collaborative reproduction many years ago.
Wonderful. I know that we have had multiple conversations about our experiences. I am a two-time gestational surrogate. Ryan has personal and professional experience. So as we are going through this webinar today, I do encourage anyone who's watching to shoot your questions into the chat. We'll be happy to answer those live on screen. I do have some of my own questions, of course, to kind of like guide our conversation, but always fun to kind of just a back and forth on really how assisted reproduction attorneys and the agencies kind of help our intended parents. So I think the main question that I want to start out with is, what does an assisted reproduction attorney do? Why are they different from a typical attorney, and why are they important in a surrogacy or egg donation journey?
Yeah, no one ever thinks about needing an attorney, right? Nobody ever wants to have an attorney. But when you do engage a lawyer, you want somebody who specializes in that area. I suppose we don't consider ourselves experts, right? But someone who practices in that area and knows what the constant and consistent updates are to the law, and understanding pivots in state law or any developments across other states. Your attorney in your surrogacy or your egg donation, any sort of collaborative reproduction, has to be licensed in the state that has some nexus to your arrangement, whether it's where you live or where the surrogate lives or your egg donor lives or where the procedure is going to occur. And so you want to make sure that you have competent counsel, and competent counsel is someone who has a very good understanding of the impact of the law on your arrangement, whether it's egg donation or surrogacy. You wouldn't hire a criminal defense attorney to represent you in your egg donation.
Exactly.
And similarly, if you're in a surrogacy arrangement, you're going to want somebody who has experience and a very, very good understanding of the impact of the law on your arrangement. Because without that understanding, you may not be receiving the type of legal representation that you should in these arrangements.
Yeah. And you said that you don't consider yourself an expert, and I probably will disagree with you there, because the whole point of these conversations and the whole point of really, employing an attorney who knows the surrogacy industry is because they are the expert. Like, you are not 100% going to hit everything on the nose, but you do know what types of things are important for the contracts, and you guide your intended parents through that. I know that within the agency, we will suggest other experts like yourself, like you said, depending on the nexus and depending on where they are located and how the parents need to be connected. But having someone who can collaborate on that attorney or that contract with you and make sure that the important details are in the contract going forward. I think that's the most important thing. And I love your analogy. I know we say it all the time of you wouldn't hire someone. We get that question occasionally where parents will ask, well, my friend is an attorney. Can I just use them? If your friend is a specialized attorney in surrogacy and egg donation contracts, understands what needs to be in there, of course. But let me also recommend these three others that we have great reputations with and know that we have a good history.
Joy, I've been in arrangements where I have represented, whether it be intended parents or a surrogate, say, in a surrogacy arrangement, and the other side is represented by somebody who's never worked in the area, and they're a patent attorney who are brilliant people, but I was concerned about whether or not the other side was receiving the competent counsel during the arrangement. That's up for them to decide, but I did have concerns, and so if anybody asks me, I'm going to tell them, there are ways to identify attorneys who specialize in this area, and you really should have a conversation with one of them before you decide on an attorney to represent you.
Exactly. It's super important that your best interests are met, and you're not going to know what those are until you have someone who understands the process. Wonderful conversation. Love it. Why do we even need a legal contract?
Yeah. So, when this question comes up a lot, actually, is when you have siblings that are working with each other, a surrogate who is going to carry for her sister, her brother, brother-in-law, sister-in-law. Why do we need a contract? Those are the cases where you absolutely must have a contract. I'm going to simplify this because I say this all the time to people. Lawyers are hired to contemplate worst case scenarios, among other things, right? What happens when things go sideways, right? Not very few do, right? Very few of them do go sideways, but when they do, man, are you grateful that you have that contract there, right? So here's the thing. The contract between the parties, between the surrogate and her spouse being one party and the intended parent or parents being the other party, those agreements sort of lay out the playbook for the arrangement. They lay out the terms and the rights and the obligations, but also the hopes and desires of the parties in the arrangement. How are we going to accomplish this shared goal, which is for someone to build their family or grow their family? And so when we talk about rights and terms and obligations, those are sort of the automatic things in the agreement, like discussion of where is she going to deliver? How are we paying for this? What is the insurance that we're using? And we're also tying it back to the requirements that the law may demand, right? So, for example, here in Illinois, we have requirements that you must meet as a threshold in order to participate in a surrogacy arrangement, right? The surrogate has to have delivered her own children. That one should be obvious, right? She has to be at least 21. She has to have insurance. The intended parents have to have contributed at least one of the gametes, right? Meaning at least one of them has to be a genetic contributor under the Gestational Surrogacy Act. You have to have a medical need in the state of Illinois. And so the importance of this, as it relates to the contract, is that we are actually checking those boxes in the agreement before we get into that playbook. Okay. And so there's conversations about a lot of the things that intended parents or surrogates will say, gosh, I didn't even think about that. And so that's when lawyers say, we didn't think you would. That's why the contract is there, right? For example, travel restrictions, right? There has to be a travel restriction in the contract. And let me back up actually, because I think this is important. I know that we talked about this the last time, and this is the way that I think about every conversation that I'm having with a potential client is the two buckets that relate to the law in a surrogacy arrangement. Okay. The first bucket is the direct contract between the intended parents or parent and the surrogate and her spouse, if she has one. Those are the two parties. Okay. So in that first bucket, we have a contract that is laying out all these terms and the rights and the obligations and the expectations of the parties. Okay. That is sort of a threshold matter. You have to have the contract in place before medications can begin. Ultimately, after the contract is signed, legal clearance gets sent to the clinic. So the physician says, okay, we have a contract in place. We can proceed. Um, and then the lawyer should be getting out of the way at that point, right? Let the medical professionals do their job. Let's focus on embryo transfer, taking the medications, embryo transfer. And then once we get through, usually around the end of the first trimester, that's when the lawyers sort of step back in and we start to focus on the second bucket, which is the establishment of legal parentage. Okay. The establishment of legal parentage is necessary because I guess this is the easiest way to summarize this is that there's a presumption that attaches to a pregnant woman. And it's that she's carrying her own legal, natural, and biological child. So the lawyers are necessary because what we're doing is we're rebutting that presumption. We're figuring out the ways to present evidence that she is in fact not the legal, natural, or biological parent, and neither is her spouse if she has one. Now, the answer to that question as to how do you rebut the presumption depends. It depends on state law. It depends on where she delivers as to the processes or procedures necessary to do that. I'm telling you all this in relation to your question because going back to that one section of the agreement, the travel restriction, why do we put travel restrictions in contracts? We do it because of what I was just talking about, because we've already done work, right? We've already established a legal parentage preliminarily, at least during the pregnancy. Okay. And so if that surrogate were to leave the state where she intends to deliver, let's say she lives in Chicago and she goes away to Wisconsin for the weekend in week 37 of the pregnancy, and she goes into labor and delivers in Wisconsin. Guess what? No one in the state of Wisconsin knows that she is not the legal parent to that child. I mean, it can happen pretty quickly,
Mhm.
but at least temporarily, there's a question about legal parentage until the lawyers can get their hands on it. So those are the types of things that you want to avoid, right? And so really what we're doing is setting expectations and setting boundaries and guardrails for the parties so that the parties have peace of mind during the arrangement. And I'm only hitting on one example, but I'm sure through the rest of the conversation we'll talk about some more.
Exactly. I think the most important part for me when I was going through my legal contracts, like you said, is just the what ifs. I need something that's going to guide me if we ever have any disputes, any hiccups, any confrontations, something on paper that we have all agreed to that says this is how the journey is going to go. Because we all hope, and in my case, I was very blessed. We had the legal contract, I put it away in a file and I never touched it again. It was
Yeah.
never needed. It was never even brought up into conversation. And that's wonderful.
I
But
make that comment all the time. I tell people, I hope you don't have to look at this thing. I
exactly,
hope that your escrow agent is doing their job, and the relationship between you and your surrogate is wonderful, and you never have to wonder what you're supposed to do in certain circumstances. That's the goal, I think, in every arrangement.
exactly. And in a beautiful, wonderful journey with zero hiccups, that's what should happen. However, it's lovely to know that that conversation is going to be made so much easier if it arises that you have this document that kind of governs exactly what the answer needs to be. All right. So in the first 12 minutes of our webinar, we have kind of proven that you need a specific attorney for your legal contracts. You even just touched very briefly on escrow management. Contracts will dictate all of the disbursements and all the financial issues that have to have. And so we will upload your legal document to your escrow, and that will help them govern how the funds are allocated. I mean, there are just so many moving parts to a gestational surrogacy agreement. You need to have an experienced, knowledgeable attorney on your side to make sure you're protected. So if I'm an intended parent and I am looking for an attorney, step one, I'm going to reach out to my agency. I'm going to ask them, who should I use? And your agency should be able to provide you 2 to 3 very reputable, logical, and able attorneys in their area. Able meaning they're going to be able to be licensed in the states that you need, whether that's for the parentage or
Lawyers
locally.
use the word competent a lot.
Competent. We'll use competent. I didn't want to be too
Yeah,
humbling or demeaning,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah,
not being from the lawyer
yeah.
speak, I will say
Right.
able. Um, but if you don't have an agency, or if you don't want to trust the agency, which I would not suggest, and you're going to search out an attorney on your own, where should parents start?
I guess I'm going to answer that question. I think um, in a way to describe how a lot of people end up with me.
Perfect.
I mean, a lot of it obviously is the recommendation of an agency like Family Source Consultants, who will say, "Listen, we work with Ryan all the time. Have a conversation with him. Here's a couple other recommendations as well. Find the right fit for you." And I tell people all the time, look, if you're already sick of my voice during this first conversation, we're probably not a good fit because you're going to be hearing a lot of it. Okay. And so these are very lengthy conversations that we're having where I'm,
Yep.
trying to understand what their hopes and desires are for the arrangement. And so that's one way. The agency has their sort of, I guess, preferred partners or, lawyers that they do a lot of work with and also know that they get the job done, right? That their previous clients are happy with the work that was done, and so that's where a lot of the recommendations come from. Then there's mental health professionals. A lot of intended parents, by the time they get to me, but I say this all the time too. When intended parents come to me, that I know that the one thing that they don't have any more of is patience, mostly because they've experienced this very lengthy process and frankly unexpected. I remember being there. Every new step was a new challenge for us, and so um, you may have other professionals involved other than your agency before you get to a lawyer, like mental health professionals, right? You may have
Yep.
been speaking with a counselor up to that point, and they may have their own recommendations because they have had previous patients who have had experiences that ended up with in a surrogacy arrangement. So there's medical professionals, mental health professionals. Your clinic may have recommendations. Your friends may have been through this will say, "Look, we worked with Brian or Joanna or whoever it might be," and you say, "I had a great experience with them. You should give them a call." And it may not be the right fit for you, but start the conversation there. And so this, in the same way that people are sort of interviewing agencies where they're, having hour-long conversations. I don't think you're ever going to find a lawyer who's not interested in an hour-long conversation just to determine whether or not you're the right fit for each other, because it is a lengthy process and you're going to be spending a lot of time together.
Yeah, if they're not willing to have that initial conversation and put in that time, you probably need to start looking for something else.
That's actually my favorite part, frankly, is that initial conversation, just because of the getting to know people is really my favorite part about the attorney-client relationship.
Yeah. Well, and there's so much that goes into it, like you said, how much of the story needs to be told so you can understand where they're coming from and what's important to them prior to getting to the nitty-gritty of the legal.
That's right.
Um, yeah, so a big question that we always have at the agency is what can we do to help prepare parents? What are some of the topics, some of the main key points that are in a legal contract that you think it would be beneficial for parents to start thinking about now or start thinking about before that first conversation?
Yeah. Um, so I suppose you have to think about this in from where the intended parent is sitting, because when they're coming into it, they're wondering, and this is a conversation I have all the time. They're always wondering, what do I need to know before I sit down with an agency so that I can sort of paint this picture for them of what I hope this arrangement's going to look like, right? Do I need to come with a whole list of criteria about what how I want this to play out? No, you do not. That's the great fear of intended parents. Again, I was there. I said, remember saying to Lindsay, What are we prepared for this conversation? Do we know what to tell them, what we want? What I didn't know is that any reputable agency has been doing this for long enough, and they are going to ask you the questions so that they are creating this lens that they can look through to go find the best possible match for them. Same thing for me, right? By the time they get to me, they shouldn't have to tell me more than I ask them answers for,
Exactly.
right? I am prepared to ask you every single thing I need to know in order to create that lens that I'm going to look through when I'm drafting an agreement. Now, however, there are certain things obviously that maybe you need to think about a little bit more than when you're put on the spot with your agency or your attorney, right? For example, at both levels, you're going to have a conversation about a potential termination of pregnancy. What does that look like, right? What are the situations in which you think you might request a termination of pregnancy? Because you don't want to be matched with somebody unless they are absolutely on the same page with you. And so that's at the agency level, finding the match where you're like-minded. What the lawyer is going to do is take that same information and document it, right? We want to make sure that the parties are memorializing their intentions and their hopes for those types of situations. So, a potential termination, you don't need to come to the table and say, well, I know that in situation A, B, C, and D, I'm going to react this way, right? There, I ask very pointed questions, very specific questions that are protected by the attorney-client relationship. I'm not actually documenting the answers to those questions, but they're helping me understand what I need to know to draft an agreement that protects my client's interest. Okay. And so that's a big one, right? That's a really, really big one when it comes to the agreement. Now, a fear that intended parents often have is about the financials, right? And so by the time they get to a lawyer, they want to make sure that, and this is what I tell them is, look, I'm going to be throwing, if I'm representing the intended parents, I'm going to be throwing guardrails up wherever I can so that, there's a full understanding of what's going to happen in certain situations as it relates to the distribution of the money out of escrow. So let me give you an example. Family Source Consultants does a great job. They provide us with the financial amounts, the terms that are agreed to, okay, prior to even getting to me. But we can take those a step further. For example, let's say that, I know that the compensation is a lot more than this, but let's say that the compensation is $10. Okay. Is she earning that in 8 payments of $1.25? Or is she earning that in 10 payments of $1? That's up to us, right? What is the threshold that she must meet in order to earn the full amount of the compensation? In other words, how does she earn the $10? Does she have to make it to a certain point in the pregnancy? That's a standard part of any contract, that it's usually 32 weeks or 34 weeks or whatever the parties agree on. And so, tying this back to your original question, you want somebody that's seen a lot of these contracts to know what those terms should look like in the financials, or what is a good compromise between the parties. Um, Spouses lost wages is always a big one that comes up. Spouses are critical to these arrangements when you have somebody who's supporting a surrogate throughout the process, and they may be um, forfeiting PTO time or time at work to support their wife or partner, and or going to appointments, or being by their side before, during, and after delivery. Should they be reimbursed for the time that they take off? Yes, of course, right? And so if they get reimbursed for that time, how much time should they get reimbursed for? And I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but these are, you can see all these are, we're thinking about the impact on people's lives.
Exactly.
And, we certainly don't want surrogates or their families to be impacted financially from doing this really wonderful thing for somebody else. So,
Yeah.
long answer to your question, but I guess you can summarize it this way: don't worry. Intended parents are going to be taken care of by their agency, like family source consultants, and then their lawyers are going to hold their hands through all of this.
Exactly. So going into a little more detail from our perspective, for any intended parents who are going to be watching this and you're just starting out, and like you said, you might not understand what you need and you're worried about that initial conversation. We are going to present you with a profile, and we're going to present the surrogate with your profile. So it goes back and forth way before you're ever going to get to a legal contract. Some of those key points, like Ryan mentioned, the financials, the termination, maybe preferences on location or age or clinic requirements, all these things that need to fall into place for the journey to be successful are discussed and laid out in documentation at the agency level that's not legal yet, but it is a reasonable expectation that both parties agree to before moving forward. And I love that sentence. I always say this to everyone. I'm like, reasonable expectations. Whenever we're talking about finances, it needs to be a reasonable expectation for the journey. If I have an expense that I only occurred being a surrogate, that is a reasonable expectation over reimbursement. Now,
Mhm.
if because I'm a surrogate and I broke my arm, I want you to pay for my cast, no longer a reasonable expectation. If I wasn't a surrogate and I broke my arm, I'd still be paying for my cast. So I always love that reasonable expectation is something that I use a lot when I'm speaking with my parents. But I think it's really important to know that you're going to have someone on your side, whether it's at the agency level and you're matching or at the attorney level and they're talking with Ryan. You have someone on your side to help guide you. So be open, be able to have hard discussions, and then really lean on those people that are the experts that have seen this a lot, that have gone through a lot, and we will give you recommendations or our best knowledge to rectify the situation and get you an answer. Awesome. Okay, let's move on even further. So now we have searched for our attorney. We understand why we need one. We have a brief idea of what's going to go on because we've had our initial consultation. So what else are we going to cover in that initial meeting? What can parents expect from Ryan Ferrante? Because I'm not going
Yeah,
to do this
yeah,
generally. I know every attorney is different, but
yeah,
we'll go specifically to Ryan. What am I going to get in that initial meeting with you?
yeah. Initial meeting, and just to sort of describe the timing of this, we're talking about a situation where this is before you've even retained an attorney. You're having a conversation with your lawyer, and your lawyer should treat it that way. I mentioned this in the last uh, uh, webinar that we did too. Um, I want intended parents and surrogates, if I'm representing a surrogate, to be focused on their relationship with the intended parents or the surrogate, right? Um, in other words, we shouldn't be we should always be mindful of the relationship between surrogates and intended parents during this legal phase, which starts with that initial consultation, right? Of course, we're going to zealously advocate for our clients, right? However, we need to be mindful of the relationship because I gave you a little timeline earlier. There was a phase, there was a few steps where I back out for a little bit, right? I'm always going to remain available, but there's times when I'm not always involved, right? And the parties are left to sort of let their relationship evolve naturally. Okay. And so what I am doing in that initial consultation is very high level explaining what the legal process is. Okay. So that they now can imagine what the calendar is going to look like. Right. And also setting expectations. We're not going to get this done tomorrow. Right. It's going to take some time. We need the cooperation of everybody involved, the surrogates, the intended parents, both lawyers. And we're going to get to legal clearance as fast as we possibly can while making sure that we're not doing anything to damage the relationship. Okay. Now, also during that conversation, I want them to tell me as much or as little about themselves as they're comfortable sharing. Um, it's always helpful for me to understand, you know, what brought you here? What brought you to this conversation? Tell me as much or as little as you want. Um, the more you tell me, the more I'm able to understand, and that lens becomes a little bit more clear than when I'm drafting the agreement, right? Um, for example, that somebody may come to me. This is just an example. Somebody may come to me and say, "We have one embryo and one embryo left, and we are not intending to create any more." Okay, that's something that's meaningful to me, to help me understand um, what this arrangement's going to look like, right? Everything's starting to come into a little bit more focus as we continue to have conversations. um, but I also want them to know that even though there are parts of that, the arrangement where I am sort of stepping back to let medical professionals do the really important work, that I'm not going anywhere. I'm always available. Um, uh, I I have a very understanding spouse, and so being available 7 days is important to my clients because you know pregnancy doesn't take the weekends off, right? And so um, we're setting expectations in that first conversation, and I'm also reminding them you should talk to other lawyers, right? You should have conversations with other lawyers. No one's forcing you to work with one particular lawyer, and you want to make sure that you're comfortable with them before you retain them.
Exactly. And if you have a good agency by your side, they will recommend a few attorneys because that is important. It's what is best for you and the intended parents in the journey. So we want you to
Yep.
be comfortable. And like you said, your clients are going to have a lot of FaceTime. They're going to have a lot of conversations. If that's not something they're comfortable with, they need to have the ability to go somewhere else. But
Hmm.
if they go somewhere else and they feel like they're not getting that attention, I can guarantee I know someone they can talk to.
Yep.
All right. So now we're drafting the contract. We've moved forward. We've gotten our initial contract. We have medical clearance. Hoorah! Surrogates moving forward. I give you the green light. Say, Ryan, my clients are ready. My parents are ready. They're ready to start the contract. Take it away. And you
Hmm.
kind of take over. So, like, um, what kind of changes and what kind of discussions are you going to have about that legal contract? Kind of walk us through that
Yep.
process.
Yep. All right. Obviously, a lot of this is pretty standard, right? Where we're talking about those threshold requirements under Illinois law before the parties can participate in an Illinois arrangement. But this is, I mentioned earlier, we're talking, those initial conversations are sort of high level. Now we're starting to peel the layers back a little bit, right? What is it that how did you imagine this is going to play out? So we have conversations about what does the delivery room look like? Do you is it an absolute must for you that you must be in the delivery room? Now it's sort of a relic of the pandemic where they were limiting the number of support people that were allowed in the delivery room, but we also have to contemplate that. What if we have another global pandemic and they limit the number of support people in the room to one person? Are the intended parents going to have a real problem with that being the surrogate spouse or her support person? Usually that's what we default to, right? Um, then we also explain to them that they can attend routine appointments, right? Intended parents can attend routine appointments. Not always possible. I'm going to use my own um, path to parenthood as an example. My wife and I live in Chicago. Our surrogate lived in Tallahassee, Florida. We weren't getting in the car to go to a routine appointment, right?
Yeah.
Some intended parents are lucky enough to be able to get in the car and drive to a routine appointment. Can they go to that appointment? Of course, subject to the policies of the facility and the medical professionals involved. Again, setting the expectations of the parties. Okay. So we have those conversations about appointments, about what the delivery room is going to look like. We also have to talk about how this is going to get paid for, right? I'm not talking about compensation or the fees, but intended parents in any surrogacy arrangement, they need to think about how this would be paid for if it was a routine pregnancy, right? The intended parents are responsible for all pregnancy related medical expenses. Then we layer on top of that any available insurance. What insurance? Is it hers? Is it somebody else's? Is it something that has to get purchased? That's a conversation that she's going to have with the agency, or the intended parents are going to have with the agency. Some things are going to pierce that layer, right? Like uncovered expenses, copays, and deductibles. Who's responsible for that? The intended parents. We're going to lay all of that out in the contract. I mentioned earlier the travel restriction. Now, this is an area where I always tell my clients to anticipate that there's going to be a potential change. Why? I hope no other lawyers are listening, but I take a very conservative approach to travel restrictions, right? I want to make sure that we're not doing anything to allow, well, I shouldn't say it that way. I want to do everything I can to mitigate the possibility that the surrogate is going to deliver anywhere other than where she intends to deliver. So what
Okay.
do? We put a travel restriction on and say you can't leave the state of Illinois after the second trimester, or you can't leave the state of Illinois after the second trimester, and you got to stay within 75 miles of the delivery hospital. Okay. And so now there's an expectation about what her travel is going to be. On the other side, I'm telling the surrogate, or I'm asking the surrogate, I need you to think about your life over the next 18 months to 2 years. Do you have anything planned, or is anything that you do routinely that's going to put you outside of this perimeter? In the conversation with the intended parents, did you talk to the surrogate? Did she say anything to you about planned travel or blackout dates, or she's taking the kids to Disney in October, which would mean it could be week 26, but it could be week 29.
Mhm.
Have you had that conversation? And so it's really this next, when we're peeling the layers back, now I want to know what expectations have been set based on conversations that you've had with the gestational carrier and her spouse. Okay. And so the financials, really, we don't need to spend too much time on those, other than me explaining how I'm going to throw the guardrails up, right? I say this to intended parents. I don't want it to be impossible for her to get reimbursed for lost wages. She should be reimbursed for what's fair, right? But we also want to think about, protecting intended parents from being taken advantage of, right?
Exactly.
We don't want them to be in a position where they're, you know, um, uh, reimbursing for lost wages for things that are not directly related to the surrogate's participation. And so we got to make sure that we have drawn very clear lines there. Intended parents don't need to be concerned about the surrogates or their input on the surrogate's conduct or her behavior or her lifestyle. We contemplate all of that in the agreement, and we generally point back to physician instructions, right? The physician, whatever the physician tells you to do, you agree to do it during the arrangement. Um, you know, I make a joke all the time. If a physician tells her to eat 38 bananas in the 3 days before the transfer, she agrees to eat 38 bananas, right? If there's any surrogates listening, they don't ask you to eat 38 bananas before
I've never
transfer.
eaten 38 bananas.
Yeah, I mean, they may, there's always the sort of, it's not really a joke, but it's common to say eat a little pineapple and then French fries after, right? But we lean on physician instructions, but then we certainly do call out certain conduct that we want to make sure that the surrogate is at least read. No unnecessary x-rays and no hazardous activities. And if you have cats in your home, somebody else is going to have to change that cat litter, right? And so we want to have a pretty good idea of what's going on in the home, what the support network looks like. This is not just the agency doing this, and the agency filling me in. Family Source Consultants is giving me the information that I need to understand some of the information that you guys are collecting as part of your intake. But changes in development of the contract and then modifications to it, this is not law and order. These are not hostile negotiations. We're, lawyers who are experienced in this area generally are taking the approach that we're just trying to get to what's fair, okay, based on the expectations of the parties before they came into the legal process.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note that the contract is going to go back and forth between the parties multiple times. If a contract is sent, typically the intended parents attorney will draft the contract. That's how the majority of attorneys
Yeah.
work. And then they
Most,
will review
yeah.
it. Most
Yeah.
majority, we'll say most, put that
Yeah.
disclaimer in there.
Yeah.
But then they
Well,
will review, add any little comments, like Ryan said, any specifics or minor changes. And then they send that over to the surrogate's attorney. They review, add their changes. Again, maybe filter in something that's important to their specific lifestyle or something
uh-huh.
that they may be hoping for, wishing for within the journey. Then it gets sent back and forth. I would be very apprehensive if I saw a contract only go once and then signatures happen. It
Yeah.
happens. I've seen it, but it's really important that both parties and the attorneys are looking out for your best interests. Read through every detail. Make sure that you're thinking ahead. Do I have a vacation coming up? For me, it's always important that every sentence ended with doctor recommendations, like you said, or with approval by both parties, so that if something did come up that was outside the contract, there was still that opportunity for us to discuss it. Now, I was
Hmm.
really close with my intended parents, so that worked out well. But if we didn't agree, we'd fall back on the contract. Whatever was written is law. So
Yeah.
it's so important to know that just because something gets changed or a red line is presented, like you said, it's not hostile. It's not the end all be all. It is open for
Yeah.
discussion.
Yeah.
No, we're not changing. Oh, we thought we were going to transfer one embryo. Now we want to transfer four. Well, that's not open for discussion. That's against doctor recommendations, et cetera,
Right.
et cetera. There are certain things that will be absolutes, but a lot of those other details, like you said, that are going to make the journey personal to both parties are up for discussion. So
Yeah.
be open to that discussion. Now, do you see any? I've always been curious. Do you see anything different between an egg donation contract and a surrogacy contract? Is there any like main factor that you've noticed that's a little different? Maybe some sections that are omitted or elaborated upon for either one?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to answer the question this way. I've had many, many clients who have been, recipient parents in an egg donation and then later become surrogacy clients. And so I can only tell you what their reaction is, which is, oh my gosh, the surrogacy contract is so much longer and complicated and complex and contemplates so many more um, terms and provisions and contingencies, and it's a much lengthier document. And that's I think that the biggest difference is the what we're asking of egg donors or asking of surrogates is not as complicated, obviously, in an egg donation. And particularly when you're talking about an anonymous donation, there's a limit as to how much you're going to talk about in an anonymous donation, just because the parties don't have identifying information about the other party. But if you're in a known donation, for example, um, it's one procedure, right? You're talking about one procedure where you're preparing for that one procedure. And so the contract is going to lay out the expectations of the parties. For the intended parents, it's really about providing the resources, right? Providing the clinic and access to the physician and reimbursement for fees and any sort of compensation that may be involved, right? Now, it's just for that one procedure. That's it. Whereas in a surrogacy contract, we have to think about a lot more. We have to think about um, her conduct and her lifestyle in the lead up to the beginning of medications. And then we have to think about her conduct and her lifestyle in the immediate aftermath of the embryo transfer. And then once she achieves a pregnancy, her conduct and her lifestyle during the pregnancy and the expectations about what delivery is going to look like. Whereas in an egg donation, we have an expectation that you're going to listen to the physician, right? There's so many rules that I think about when I'm reviewing somebody else's surrogacy contract. So many rules, right? In an egg donation, I'm thinking about three. Okay. When I look at somebody else's egg donation contract, here's what I'm thinking about. Number one, I want to make sure that they are acknowledging in the contract that there's only two parties, right? One party is the recipient parents, and the other is the egg donor. Meaning, we didn't talk about a very specific person the resulting child, right? We can't place obligations on somebody who's not alive. Okay. So that's rule number one. Rule number two, any discussion about the financial terms is not for the material, right? It's for her time, it's for her participation, it's for listening to the physician, it's for undergoing the procedure, right? And so that's what she's being compensated for, regardless of whether they're able to retrieve 1 egg, 10 eggs, 50 eggs, 0 eggs, doesn't matter. If she undergoes the procedure, she gets her comp. And then the last rule is listen to the physician, right? And so what I mean by that in this context is I don't want anybody trying to play doctor. And this would apply to the surrogacy contract as well. This is a rule that sort of overlaps in both. I don't like anything in the contract that says if intended parents request that, and then that is followed by some sort of medical instruction. That's coming out, right? I'm representing a surrogate. And so there are some things that overlap, but it's a much simpler document when we're talking about egg donation.
And I think I mean, at the base of it all, it's just a matter of time too. Typically your egg donation journey is going to be about a third of the time of the surrogacy journey. So there's much more things that could happen in the 18
Right.
months of a surrogacy than, the 6, let's say, of an egg donation. So I'm glad
That's
that
right.
we have attorneys that are by our side to kind of cover all those situations, all those what ifs, and really
They're not
give
all
us those
bad. Not all lawyers are bad.
It's awesome. All right, Ryan. Well, I always like to finish. We'll do one last question. I always like to put you on the spot at the very end and kind of just ask, like, what is your overall advice for any intended parents that might be listening right now?
Well, if there is an intended parent that's listening, you are already way ahead of where most intended parents are going to be by the time you start the process. Or if you've already started the process and you're listening now, you're far more prepared. I'm not saying that my advice or any information that I'm sharing is going to be helpful to you, but merely wanting to hear conversations about surrogacy, there's so much, it can be very overwhelming. You don't know where to start. You don't know where to turn. And merely by tuning into people talking about surrogacy who have some experience in it is going to be immensely helpful, right? I wish that my wife and I had, tuned into conversations like this when we first started, just because it would have been helpful to hear people talking about certain things that I thought we needed to be concerned about. But that's something that I try and drive home with anyone who is, calling me just to have a conversation. I probably spend more time talking to non-clients about surrogacy than I do my own clients. And so just wanting to have the conversation or weighing in on one is going to be immensely helpful during the arrangement, because you've heard about some of the pitfalls maybe, or some things that you need to be prepared for, not right now, but maybe in week 12 or week 20 or week 32, or as you get ready to prepare for delivery. All those things, whether you're reading it or listening to these types of conversations, will be very, very, very helpful.
I really appreciate your time, Ryan. You're always a pleasure to talk. I'm going to stop us now because I know you and I can speak forever and ever about these situations, and we'll just continue for hours, but it's always
my
wonderful to
pleasure.
have you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Joy.
Absolutely. And for anyone listening or whoever watches this webinar, you are always welcome to reach out to Family Source Consultants. We are happy to give you more information. You can get in contact directly with Ryan Ferrante. He would, like you said, he's welcome to have conversations with you as long as you need. We will share our expertise, we'll share our guidance, and then help you make the right decisions for you. So if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to go to familysourceconsultants.com or email info@familysourceconsultants.com. So thank you again, Ryan. Have a wonderful day, and look
Thanks,
forward
Joy.
to the next webinar.
See you soon.
Bye.